Good morning. Is the sound okay? Thank you. How is everybody?
Great, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Do you have any questions that you want to ask before I start on today's lecture? Okay. I'm talking about the antebellum South. Many of you already know where that phrase antebellum comes from, but in case you don't, now you do. And you know that I'll be talking about slavery, but today I'm also talking about the structure and the hierarchy of white society as well as African American slave culture. Slavery in the antebellum South was more than an economic institution. It was certainly that. It was a system of bonded labor. But it was a social institution, and it served a very distinctive social purpose. Now, you may or may not know this, but most white Southerners, in fact, the majority, the overwhelming majority of white Southerners, were not members of slaveholding families. Were not members of slaveholding families. In fact, according to historian of the South John Bowles, in 1860, 76% of the white population were members of families that did not own any slaves, whereas only 24% of white society were members of slaveholding families. Now, what is significant here, it's important to remember this in terms of how the South presents itself to itself, how the South presents itself to the North, and it's important to remember this in terms of who serves in the Confederate Army. Do you think it was mostly the children from slaveholding families? No. It was mostly the men from non-slaveholding families. In my opinion, and this is an unflattering opinion as far as the South is concerned, but in my opinion, this is a classic example of a rich man's war, the Civil War, and a poor man's fight. But I continue. There was a hierarchy among white society. I'll just remind you what the slave states were in 1860. At the very top of that hierarchy is what we call the planter aristocracy. Large houses, dozens of slaves, thousands of acres of prime land. This is probably less than 1% of the white population. And the white population was 8 million. About 2,300 families of this 8 million owned 100 or more slaves. This was the planter aristocracy, an extremely wealthy group. Only 1/5 or 22% of the nation's white population, the entire nation, its white population, only 1/5 lived in the South. But 2/3 of all men in the United States who had estates valued at $100,000 or more were Southerners. A lot of wealth in the South, concentrated in, relatively speaking, a very few hands. This was the planter aristocracy. And of course, forced labor was the basis of almost every Southern fortune. Below the planter aristocracy, and I suggest, I don't know who these houses belonged to, or what their income was, or how many slaves they owned, but I would suggest to you that the house in the upper right is probably the home of someone in the planter aristocracy. And the house in the lower right, upper left, lower right, I'm sorry, is a house very grand, but of a wealthy planter. Not quite the planter aristocracy. Now, these are made up terms. These aren't terms that Southerners used. These are terms that historians and sociologists of the antebellum South have coined. The wealthy planters, we think of the wealthy planters as planters who owned 20 slaves. 20 slaves would be the minimum for running a plantation as opposed to a farm. 12% of all slaveholders in 1860 qualified as these wealthy planters. So you take the planter elite and the wealthy planters, they controlled most of the most fertile land, and they had the best access to transportation. The richest 10% of Anglo-Americans in the South owned almost 2/3 of all the farm wealth. Now, this is far above the 40% figure in states like Illinois and Wisconsin. And the only point I'm making, there were wealthy, wealthy, wealthy farmers in Illinois and Wisconsin and many other states. But the point I'm making is that wealth was much more concentrated in the South than in the northern farm states. And then we get to the mid-level slave-owning families. Now, you can look at this tonight. It's basically what I'm saying. This is basically what I'm saying. Mid-level slave-holding farm families, about 70% of all the families in the South who owned slaves. So this is the biggest percentage of white Southerners who owned slaves, about 270,000 people. But what we rank as a mid-level slaveholding farm family is a family that owns 10 or fewer slaves. The typical slaveholder worked on a small family farm with about 100 acres and 8 or 9 slaves. These slaves were perhaps members of the same family. Most slaves, however, just think of the numbers. Most slaves, however, were likely to be in a group of 20 or more slaves on a large farm or a small plantation. Because on a large farm or a small plantation, you have 100, 150 slaves. Now, cotton could be profitably grown by these small mid-level farmers who owned 7 to 8, 9 slaves. And this is because the overhead in deciding to have a cotton farm was not great. This was not an economy of scale. Do you understand what an economy of scale is? Look it up. I could explain it to you, but I've got a lot to do. It was not an economy of scale. So the mid-level cotton farmer that owned 7 or 8 slaves could, in fact, grow cotton profitably. He was not going to make as much money as the plantation owner who had 600 acres and 100 slaves, of course. But it was not an economy of scale. So he could earn a profit. He could be in commercial agriculture. Cotton could be profitably grown on any scale. And then there were farmers who grew cotton who did not own any slaves. Between 2/3 and 3/4, of the white population of the antebellum South were families that had no slaves. but most owned small farms. These are the yeoman farmers. They own their farms. They're growing vegetables for their family. They're probably growing a little cotton so they can get cash to buy things they can't make themselves or barter for. But these are small, independent farmers. They own their own land. And this is perhaps a yeoman farmer's house. It's called a dog trot because of the passageway between the two sides of the houses where the dogs can run through, whatever. Now, the population of yeoman farmers was scattered throughout the South. It was not concentrated in one or another region. These yeoman farmers lived in the foothills of mountains. They generally were not able to buy and therefore grow anything on the best land, but they were landowners, yeoman farmers. They were self-sufficient farmers. They didn't need to live near market towns. They worked together as a family. They mostly raised corn and wheat, maybe a few hogs, maybe a little cotton. In other words, these were farmers that were still basically subsistence farmers. They maintained a household economy and usually lived in two-room log houses. In some ways, these farmers were the solid backbone of the antebellum South. In 1860, for example, in North Carolina, 70% of all the farmers, white farmers, owned less than 100 acres each. In 1860, in Mississippi and Louisiana, and these had the reputation of being the large plantation states. But over 60% of the farmers in these states farmed farms under 100 acres. Now, the interesting thing about yeoman farmers, they're not getting rich. It's a household economy. It's subsistence farming for the most part, but they own their land, which means that all through the century, even before the qualifications for white male suffrage went down, they had always been able to vote. They had always had a share of political power. Now, below the yeoman farmer were a group of white Southerners that we refer to as herdsmen. These people didn't own any land. They were just kind of here and there. They're called herdsmen because they raised hogs and other livestock. And they lived among the plantations and among the small farms, supplying bacon and pork to local slaveholders. And they marketed some of the bacon or pork. The South raised about 2/3 of all the nation's hogs. And then below the herdsmen, yes, there were people with less than the herdsmen. And they were called, rather derisively, even by white society, they were called poor whites. Hillbillies, dirt eaters, poor white trash. And they lived just wherever they could. Now, the reason they were called dirt eaters is because there is a condition called geophagy. That's people that eat clay. That the disease is eating clay or dirt. Why would people do that? It's a compulsion to eat clay or dirt if you are deficient in a particular vitamin or mineral. And these people were so poor. They were very malnourished. I'm sorry, I don't remember what vitamin or mineral. and I don't have it written down. Let's see. Some of the poor whites, most of them lived in isolated areas. Poor soil of the pine barrens, sand hills, around marshes. Some were able to grow a little corn, a few vegetables. Now, they didn't own the land. They were just sort of growing stuff on it. Some made corn whiskey. Some worked as farmhands. Poor living conditions and their poor diet. These people were often prey to malaria and hookworm and other diseases. An English visitor toured through the antebellum South in the 19th century, and she referred to poor whites in the South as the most degraded race of human beings, claiming an Anglo-Saxon origin that can be found on the face of the earth. Yeah. But why were these people poor? There were no jobs in the South. These people were poor because there were no jobs. The people that worked in the fields were slaves or family members. There was very little industry. There was, if they could not buy land, and they had not been able to buy land, they were without a way to make a living, meaning they were going to be poor. They could not move into town and get a job because there basically were no jobs. Yes, in some towns there were, little stores that sold this and that, and they were run by family members of whoever owned the store. There were no jobs. These people were kept poor by the fact of slavery. Now, one thing that we see, and we see this in both the North and the South in the antebellum decades, and that is the stratification of wealth. Wealth is becoming more concentrated. And this means inequality is more obvious. Now, this had not always been the case in the colonies of the United States. There had always been rich people, there had always been poor people. But I'm talking about extremes where there are fantastically rich people and incredibly poor people. Some of the social and economic mobility, there was some social and economic mobility in the early years of the 19th century. Recall the economic and social mobility of the 17th century, the 1600s, when people were moving here and there was the Headright program and people were dying and there was a lot of turnover and it was relatively easy to get land. It's not that way in the 19th century. Descendants of wealthy planting families from colonial Virginia, say, or South Carolina, those descendants who inherited from their families had a distinct advantage, but this advantage was not necessarily decisive. Fortunes could be lost by poor businessmen. Descendants of the wealthy could lose their place to aggressive, shrewd men on the make. But still, class lines, the difference between the rich, the middling, and the very poor, class lines, economic stratification was hardening during the antebellum years. And movement into the economic elite was becoming extremely rare. Of the richest 440 families in South Carolina in 1850, only 1 in 10 had earned rather than inherited the bulk of his fortune. of the bulk of that family's fortune. It was very difficult to move into the planter elite. It was also more difficult to move into wealthy planter status. And one reason for this was the rising price of slaves. Now, owing to African American slave culture and the African American family that established itself in the 18th century, the slave population was growing by natural increase, but it was not growing fast enough to keep up with demand. So, whenever demand exceeds supply, the price goes up, right? The proportion of white families owning slaves fell from over 1/3 in 1830 to 1/4. Only 1/4 of all the families in the South. That's 25%. Only 1/4 of all the families in the South owned slaves in 1860. Social and economic mobility was much more likely from the small farmer to the mid-level farmer. That was still possible. But those people didn't own slaves, for the most part. Now, in this kind of a system, you might expect class conflict. You know, poor whites are poor because there aren't any jobs. Because the people that have farms and that have means have slaves that do the work that poor whites might otherwise be paid for. So you might expect a fair amount of class resentment. It was getting more and more difficult. I mean, one could still buy land, but you can't buy land if you don't have workers to work the land. And so the inability of mid-level farmers to purchase more slaves meant that they were going to remain mid-level farmers. And as it happens, the slave-owning elite in the South maintained a preponderance of the political power in the South. But, now note this, by way of elections, the franchise had expanded. Virtually every white adult male in the South could vote, and yet, over and over again, adult white men voted for their betters. Wealthy families sent their kids to school. There was no education system in the South for anybody else. So the more important the office, governor, state legislator, and then U.S. senator, U.S. congressman, the more important the office, the greater the representation of the slave interest, of slaveholders. Yeah. And these offices were filled in popular elections. So what this means is that non-slave holders voluntarily deferred to the residents of the big houses. Yeoman farmers still looked up to their betters, people who had more education. And most whites in the antebellum South had a sort of regional pride because they knew that the South was considered a very prosperous region. They knew that cotton was king. And even though they weren't doing so well, they were very proud of that fact. And they knew that though they were going to remain poor, they weren't going to do better economically. They knew that they were never, ever, ever going to be black. they were never, ever, ever going to be slaves. And in this way, poor whites, herdsmen, mid-level farmers, and yeoman farmers had something in common with the men that lived in the big house. And they valued that. They valued that. And there are some historians that suggest that the lack of education in the South, the general ignorance and illiteracy of most of the whites in the South, may have encouraged a kind of political docility, may have encouraged a kind of deference to the people with education. So what this means is that the white antebellum South was very cohesive. It was not rent by class conflict, and ethnically speaking, white Southerners were much more homogeneous than white Northerners, where there are people from many different nationalities. White Southerners were much more homogeneous, and so there's an absence of class conflict, there's an absence of ethnic conflict among whites. And sometimes family ties stretched across class lines. Well, there were other things that connected at least the mid-level farmers and the yeoman farmers with the wealthy planters. And that is, well, everybody but the herdsmen and the poor whites, they were growing some cotton because it wasn't an economy of scale. And so, the mid-level farmers, they could, and they did, take their meager cotton crop to the nearest big farm or plantation because they probably owned a cotton gin. And those people were glad to gin the cotton for them. It wasn't going to take long. Why not? And they saw each other at church. And they saw each other at the feed store or whatever, and they could talk about prices of cotton. They had business in common, even though the scale of their businesses and of their profits was dramatically different. They could carry on the idea that they were in the same business. So plain folk and planters came together at church, at election rallies, at the local store, and there weren't any slaves or black people there. "90% of the South was Protestant, and 90% of the Protestants were Baptists or Methodists. So, they have a lot in common. Slavery and racism were the main forces that unified white Southerners." John Bowles again. Race ultimately united the white South. Racial fears, not planter hegemony, were at the root of Southern determination to maintain slavery in the face of Northern opposition. Non-slaveholders defended slavery as ardently as the planter elite. Come back. I'm not ready for you yet, but okay. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk about Nat Turner's revolt. And that created a fear that all white Southerners shared and increased their bond. Okay. One of the things that changed from the 18th century, the 1700s, to the 19th century, you remember during the Revolutionary era when a number of people, a number of the patriots said to each other, you know, oh my God, we all sound like hypocrites. We're talking about all men are created equal. And there's slavery in every state. We've got to change that. It's a monstrous inconsistency. Even slave owners said that. But when it came down to it, when it came down to whether or not there was going to be any all colony abolition before the Revolution, the answer was no. When it came down to the discussion of slavery in the Constitution, should we abolish slavery? The answer was no, because the delegates from the southern states said, we're going to have to leave if you abolish slavery, because we know slavery's wrong, we know it's wrong, but, you remember this term, it's a necessary evil. It's a necessary evil. How could we end slavery? Where would they go? What would they do? For one thing, we'd all be murdered in our sleep, given the way we treat them. And who knows whether or not we can ship them all somewhere. I mean, logistically, that's such a big problem. So what are we going to do? They're here. We're just going to have to live with it. It's a necessary evil. So they lived with it. Well, in the 1800s and the 19th century, more and more white slave owners and non-slaveholders began to talk about slavery as a positive good. This isn't a necessary evil. This is a positive good. Now, several things contribute to this different notion. Now, I'm sorry to be cynical, but obviously, maybe not obviously, but we have to entertain the fact that the increasing profitability of slavery may have encouraged more positive justifications for maintaining slavery. I'm just saying it's a possibility. But also at this time, some scientists, we would call them pseudoscientists today, were writing theories about race and racial differences. And virtually all whites and all white Northerners believed that people of African descent were biologically inferior to Anglo-Saxons. Now, I'm sure you know that race is a myth. In terms of DNA, in terms of genes, in terms of biological difference or similarity, there is no such thing as race. You know, there are genes that account for the amount of melanin in our skin and so on. But that has nothing to do with all the other characteristics that people associated with race. But, you know, these racial and racist beliefs were very, very strong in the 19th century. And so, white Southerners said, it's a positive good. Slavery is a positive good because these people, slaves were frequently referred to as childlike. You'll see that in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which you should start reading this weekend. And so it was common to say, I mean, we take care of these people. What would they do if they were freed? I mean, they couldn't survive. Oh my God. And you will read in your text, and next week I will talk about the antebellum reform movements. Well, Southerners, white Southerners asserted that slavery was something of a reform movement, a way to take care of people who couldn't take care of themselves, like rehabilitating the prisons and the mental institutions. Yeah. Oh my God. And white Southerners convinced themselves that they had brought Christianity to slaves. That's true. Many, many slaves of the first generation that were brought here were Muslim. Most were not converted to Christianity until the First Great Awakening of the 1700s. So, in the 19th century, white Southerners are arguing that slavery is a positive good. And here's the other thing. By this time, by the 1830s, there is industry and manufacturing and factory workers in the North, and they work for wages. And it's the truth. The wages were low, the work was hard, they were not treated well. There were no labor regulations about safety, about maximum hours, about minimum wage, nada. And so white Southerners said, with some justification, to white Northerners, especially white Northerners who opposed slavery, what do you mean? What do you mean criticizing us? What y'all are doing in the factories, that's wage slavery. Look at what you're doing. Look at how you're treating those people. And when they're sick, you don't even take care of them. They just don't make any money. That was the response. So white Southerners argued that slavery was in fact more humane than industrial capitalism. Now, things began to change on a number of different fronts. In 1829, 1830. Now, there had always been anti-slavery societies, you know that. But in 1829, with David Walker's appeal, he was an African American, a free black who lived in the North. And then, in 1830, William Lloyd Garrison begins the publication called The Liberator. Now, up until this point, abolitionism, you're going to read about abolitionism, I'll talk about it next week. Abolitionism depended upon moral suasion and convincing people this is wrong. This is wrong. We have to do what we can do to encourage people to free the slaves. Well, radical abolitionism took a much more militant tone. Radical abolitionism said, this is hellacious. And William Lloyd Garrison referred to the Constitution as a covenant with death because the Constitution mentions and implicitly sanctions slavery in 3 ways. I've talked about it before. So, the radical abolitionists are calling for abolition now. I mean, they're saying enough is enough. Abolition now. And this really, the white population in the North is greater than the white population in the South. Therefore, white representation in Congress is greater than white representation, is greater from northern states than southern states. I'll talk about the consequences of this more. Southerners were very, very nervous. What if the northern states get together and pass a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery? Oh my God, what will we do? So, and then, if they weren't worried enough, in 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was an African American slave preacher. And he hopes to instigate a slave rebellion. It doesn't work. There had been many attempted slave rebellions. Obviously, none of them worked, and Nat Turner was caught, and he and his Confederates were executed. But this scared the bejesus out of white Southerners. They were like, oh my God, if a black preacher can lead an attempted slave rebellion, we have really got to be careful. So, there were new repressions. There were new laws in every state that made it against the law to teach slaves to read. Before then, many masters or the teenage children of the masters taught slaves to read so they could read the Bible. No. You cannot teach slaves to read. Why? Because what if some abolitionist literature gets into their hands and it provokes them and it arouses them and so on? So, no, they cannot read. They cannot be taught to read. And there were more repressions. Most states passed laws that said a slave cannot be away from the plantation or the farm or whatever of his or her master without a pass. They didn't want slaves wandering around talking to each other, maybe talking about, wouldn't it be nice to be free? They couldn't put up with it. And another law was that slaves could no longer have meetings together unless a white person was present. Slaves used to have, of course, social gatherings, but also in the woods, their own church services. Because, by then, many of them read the Bible. And those of you who are familiar with the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, may be aware that there are at least two main themes in the Christian Bible that African American slaves in the 19th century drew upon. One was Christian obedience. It's your soul that's important. It's not what happens in this life. Christian obedience. And you don't hurt people, etc., etc. But there's the other story. There's the Exodus story. Yeah. There's the Exodus story. There's a liberation narrative in the Old Testament, and certainly with the message of Jesus. So what if slave preachers are still getting together with African American slaves from this and this and this plantations, and they are identifying with the ancient Jews, and Moses promising to lead them to the promised land and to freedom in Egypt? Oh my God, they might get ideas. So, no reading, no meetings among slaves unless a white person was present. Okay, well, if there's any good news, it is that once the international slave trade closed for people in the United States, the material conditions of slave life improved somewhat. You know, if your slaves died off or got diseased or got too old or whatever, it was much, much more difficult and much, much more expensive to purchase another slave. So you had to take better care of your property. And so the diet of many slaves, perhaps most slaves in the South, improved somewhat. Where slaves lived, improved somewhat. But of course, you and I know that slavery can never be, the horrors of slavery can never be reduced to the material conditions of this or that slave. Because if you're a slave in the antebellum South, you know that you will never be free. You know that your children will never be free. Well, it goes without saying that slave labor built the South. I don't need to elaborate on that. And one reason the 18th century, I'm talking about antebellum slavery, but one reason the 18th century is so crucial to the development of African American slavery and slave culture in the United States is because that is when the numbers of Africans and African Americans increased significantly in the United States. Increased so significantly that it was possible. I mean, before then, you know, there might be 2 African slaves here, and it might be 50 miles before there were more African slaves. But now, there were many more. And there were many on the same plantation or the same farm. People could know each other. People could communicate. Attractions formed. People created families. Now, if you lived on a farm with 7 or 8 slaves, you might have noticed somebody you were really attracted to that lived on the big plantation over there where there were 50 slaves. That happened. And people traveled back and forth to see each other. Now, it was not legal for slaves to marry. You know why? Because marriage might complicate the property rights of the master. Who owns this woman, the husband or the master? So, to avoid that question, there were no slave marriages. But it is well known that many masters encouraged, not legal, but unofficial slave marriages because married people have children. That was true in the African American slave culture reconstituted in the 18th century. The African American slave family was a nuclear family, and people had children. Now, as I say, on the big plantations with 30, 40, 50, you know, you and your spouse and your children lived on the same plantation. This wasn't always the case. But usually, most African American slave families were people that lived on, on a large plantation. I have to stop. I'll see you Monday.